Okay. I think we're ready. Good morning. So apologize for the brief delay. This is like this is what, the second or third time in a row that we've got to have some sort of delay with technical issues here. So I apologize for that. What seems to be happening is, just for those of you who are watching on the live Zoom, that whoever comes in the class prior to me does a lot of weird stuff, flipping switches, and it took the AV guy, what, a good 10 minutes, 15 minutes to figure it out. So it would have taken me all day and then some. So anyway, so we'll go ahead and get started. This is our schedule for today. We're going to cover chapter 8. We're really right on target with where we should be with regard to the our schedule as I laid out in the syllabus. So this is the end of week 5 today. Our next exam is coming up in 3 weeks, week 8. And so we should have no trouble getting through the material that we had intended to do. So this is going to deal with unemployment today. That's really what we're going to talk about. I think we got through everything that we needed to get through last time with respect to national income and GDP accounting. And for those of you who are in the room here, I'll pass out the attendance sheet for today. And there was one I didn't get last week. And so I passed out 2 on Tuesday. So if you didn't sign one of those for last week, you can feel free to do that. But I think we got through national income accounting last time. And if anybody have any questions about that, including like the BEA website and how we got to those numbers, etc. Anybody on the Zoom call is free to also speak up as well. So, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about unemployment today. And when we talk about unemployment, the thing that we should know is that when people say unemployment, including economists use the term unemployment, almost always talking about labor unemployment. But we should be a little bit clearer, though, when we use our terms, because unemployment, really from a pure macro definition, refers to the unemployment of any productive resource, any input. And remember, if we go back to the discussion we had, well, week 1 or week 2, I don't recall which, where we talked about factors of production, AKA input factors, land, labor, capital. Well, labor refers obviously to the labor market, and that doesn't really need that much definition, although we will describe it a little bit more in more detail. Capital refers to capital goods like machinery, equipment, real estate, plants and equipment, that sort of thing. But when unemployment happens, it's a suboptimal condition in the economy where all goods are not being employed, all inputs. So a business that was operating in 3 shifts may be operating in 2 shifts, or a company that employs 2,018 wheelers is only driving 1,500 of them. So it's unemployment of capital goods as well as labor goods. So just so that we're clear on that, when we talk about unemployment from a purely broadly construed definition, it really includes all kinds of unemployment, not just labor, which is what we think of. And in fact, all of us, everyday speech, when we talk about unemployment, we're talking about labor unemployment. Now, here's the thing. We're going to make the case, and we're going to get to this probably, if not today, then certainly into next week, that when we talk about economic policy, macro policy in this class, which is where we're sort of building up to, it really is sort of a game between managing unemployment on the one hand and managing inflation on the other. And it's sort of a whack-a-mole game. And we're going to talk about that whole business a bit later. So right now we've got a very low unemployment rate, but a very high inflation rate. So what to do about it? Well, the government is trying to slow the economy down. By slowing the economy down, we bring inflation down, but when we slow the economy down, we bring the rate of unemployment up. And I know that for anybody who's been watching the news lately, you're starting to hear about large firms laying off workers. And so far, this is sort of beginning in the technology area, companies like Microsoft and, well, certainly Twitter, but Twitter is sort of a unique situation in its own right because of its recent takeover and whatnot. But Amazon is laying off a bunch of workers. Disney is laying off a few thousand workers. Disney's not really the technology business, so it's starting to spread. But some of this, though, is going to take a bit with a grain of salt. I want to point this out because, like I heard a report this morning on Bloomberg about Ernst & Young, the big international accounting firm, is going to hire 60,000 fewer people this year than the next year. Well, that sounds pretty. I mean, you're going to hire 60,000 fewer people. But what it really means is I think there's a lot of anticipation of the economy slowing down. But I think you have to also, when I say keep with a grain of salt, if you know anything about the big accounting firms, the big 4, turnover is very, very high. They tend to hire people who are recent graduates from accounting programs who only work there a couple of years just because they're tired of working 80 hours a week traveling and, doing a lot of some godforsaken places. And so there's already a lot of turnover. And so and they're not really laying off, they're just hiring fewer. So I think some of these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt. If Walmart lays people off, that's another issue. By the way, we did get a local story about Walmart closing on the southeast side. So mostly due to, as I understand it, that the report I heard on the radio was a little bit vague. I think it was due to things like shrinkage. And so that's also not macro related. So be a bit careful when sort of judging that, hey, the economy is falling apart because of unemployment here or layoffs here. So we have to be a little bit cautious about that. But nonetheless, there is beginning to be the signs of unemployment macroeconomically. And frankly, it's because of the fact that government is engineering it. We're going to talk a lot more about that. So if you're kind of vague on what do I mean by this whole whack-a-mole experiment, well, we will talk about it. So let's talk about labor unemployment. After having gone through that whole rigmarole about clarifying that it's not just labor unemployment, it's all kinds of unemployment, we will focus primarily on what concerns economists the most, and that's labor unemployment. And there are three kinds of labor unemployment. Now, there are some textbooks that you might come across or websites that you might come across may have a fourth category called seasonal unemployment. And we're going to sort of dump seasonal into the first one here, because not all unemployment is the same. Again, this is labor unemployment, okay? Why are people unemployed, for what reasons? And we're going to sort of give some definitions as to what the unemployment rate is and how we calculate it, okay? And we'll get to that here in a second. So let's talk about the three. Oh, and by the way, as I was sort of doing some research and trying to find some data, some government data on unemployment, which I'll show you in a minute, I came across some website that had like 9 types of unemployment. And it was from some investment firm or consulting firm. And you are free, anybody's free to sort of slice and dice the unemployment rate to decide how you want to categorize things. So you may come across all kinds of, like 6 kinds of unemployment or 9 kinds of unemployment. Well, we're going to say there are 3 kinds of unemployment. In terms of measuring it, we'll give you about 6 different measures that are official measures. But those measures are different ways that we measure it. So let's be clear on that. And by the way, we'll focus on one and one only. It's what we call the U3 unemployment rate. But I'll get to that in a minute. Let's talk about the types of unemployment here. Okay. So the first of these is something that we call frictional unemployment. And this is the one that is probably the most common. And it's what we say is unemployment due to incidental reasons. Incidental reasons. And by that, it can include all kinds of things. And it generally is not necessarily related to the economy, but it's all kinds of reasons. People simply leaving their jobs for whatever reason. People quit jobs all the time and go somewhere else. That would be a case of frictional unemployment. And to the extent that someone voluntarily leaves their job and becomes unemployed, that's generally considered to be frictional unemployment. Or it could be layoffs that have nothing to do with the economy generally. Keep in mind that business firms lay people off for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with the economy, that may have more to do with their business. It could be the fact that where it simply doesn't want to have a facility that they're operating, and so they're going to lay a few thousand people off because they no longer want that particular plant, because they no longer make things there. It could be a GM with a V6 plant. Maybe they don't want to make V6 engines there anymore, so they simply lay off from workers. And so that would be an example of frictional unemployment. Now, it sounds like that might fit into some other category, but it's not really, because maybe GM's making money hand over fist, but still wants to exit from a particular business. It doesn't make any difference. Intel, a few years ago, was very, very close to closing its facility in Rio Rancho. And obviously, that's the big private employer here in the Albuquerque area. And in fact, I know that I was at a conference in which the local plant manager said very clearly that they were planning on moving most of the operations to, I think, Scottsdale or to Gilbert, Arizona, or somewhere like where they built a brand new gigantic facility. Now, it turns out, I don't know if they have done that or not. I haven't heard anything about Intel moving, but this was several years ago, and it seemed like a pretty dire warning. Now, it could have been that the state and local governments jumped in to provide incentives, which is how Intel got here in the first place, was through lots of incentives. And that's okay. I mean, businesses and government oftentimes work together with these kind of things. Same with Facebook and their facility in Los Lunas, lots of incentives. Facebook's parent company is called Meta now, but you get the idea that sometimes businesses will lay people off for all kinds of reasons. Somebody quitting is simply that issue. It could be also somebody who's a recent graduate from some program. That would be an example of frictional unemployment. For whatever reason. And I'll go down, I'll make a list of these so that we can sort of talk about these. Structural unemployment is unemployment resulting from a mismatch between workers' skills and the demand for them. This is something that's fundamentally broken in the labor market or in the market for the output that the labor is producing, the goods which are being produced here. That's really what's going on there. And I'll give some examples as to what that is, okay? Structural unemployment. And the third one is cyclical unemployment, which is unemployment that I think a lot of people think of when we think about unemployment. We think of if people are being laid off for whatever reason. We think, oh, the economy must be, going down the drain, and employers are laying people off, et cetera. But that may or may not be the case. If it is the case, if it's an overall downturn in the economy, then yes, we would say that that is an example of cyclical unemployment. So let's do this. Let's talk about this. I want to sort of elaborate on some of this and to talk about some examples of what these kinds of unemployment are. And now we've got a listing of them here. And by the way, I mentioned at the outset that there's another kind that some people have talked about in the past, and that's the idea of seasonal unemployment. Well, seasonal unemployment, we would probably just simply dump into frictional. So when we talk about, and I'm going to make a sort of a listing here of these kinds of unemployment, and just to give some examples. So it's one thing for me to talk about it, but I want to make sure that we sort of have a pretty good understanding of this, because it really does make a difference in our understanding of what's going on. So frictional unemployment, what are some examples of frictional unemployment? Well, we could say that it could be layoffs, and it could be temporary or permanent, right? Temporary or permanent. I guess I have no erasers in this reply. So temporary or permanent layoffs, for whatever the reason. And we're not saying these are due to non-macro issues, okay? And so temporary or permanent, non-macro related. That is, it's not the economy itself where everybody's laying off, okay? So temporary or permanent. Now, keep in mind, either one of these would be considered frictional unemployment. And we're going to say that in either case, it's just simply the way things are, right? These are temporary or permanent, but non-macro related, okay? This is not the economy that's going through the doldrums, and most firms lay people off, particularly larger employers, particularly employers that are in industries that we consider to be very cyclical, okay? That's not what's going on here. So temporary layoffs, so that would be one example. And I want to make sure that we have that understood, because some unemployment is inevitable. It could be voluntary unemployment. Somebody quits, right? This happens all the time. And when the labor market is strong, as it is right now, people quit all the time, sometimes with proper amount of notice or expected notice to the employer, sometimes not. When I was in the business world, there would be occasional instances where somebody would go to lunch and just never come back. And you try to call them for a couple of weeks and they just wouldn't show up. They just, I guess that was their way of telling us I quit. And it does happen. It does happen. Or, and we'll talk a bit about teen unemployment. Teenage unemployment, there are ways that we slice and dice the unemployment rate. And one of those is sometimes we include teenagers, which is basically 15 to 17. In a lot of parts of the country, age 15 is the age at which you can start working. Does anybody know what it is in Albuquerque? Is it 15? Is it 15? Okay. So 15 is a very common age to start working. But if somebody's laid off or quits their job at age 15, it's usually not an economic calamity. I know that there are occasions in which somebody, a high school worker, will quit their job because they can't get off on Friday night to go to the football game. So that's not exactly the same sort of thing as GM laying off 4,000 workers. That's a whole different thing. People quit their jobs for all kinds of reasons, and to the extent that they're unemployed. Remember, we're talking about being out of work, not somebody who quits on Friday and starts another job on Monday. That's not being unemployed. And sometimes people just simply quit a job because they just want to take some time off. And not everyone's in a position to do that. But there are cases in which people just quit working for whatever reason. Maybe there's another person that they're in a relationship with, a marriage or whatever, and the other person earns enough so that the other person cannot work. Years off when she started having kids, went back to the legal profession, once the kids, or her kids, she thought, that's me and my siblings, got old enough to do things. And so there are cases in which these things are common, they're inevitable. And from a macro standpoint, we're saying, not a big deal, not a big deal. What are some other examples of voluntary unemployment? Recent graduates, this is a big one here. That is people who graduate from some program, maybe it's a college, a trade school, a nursing program, all kinds of various tech sort of programs for healthcare related occupations, and just haven't found work yet. And so this is an example of somebody who we usually don't even count them in the labor force until they start working. And so, but once you maybe graduate from some program and now you're looking for a job, now you're in the labor force because you're looking for a job, you're looking for work. And so we try to account for that. So that'd be recent graduates. It could be also involuntarily unemployed, meaning what? This is a very wonky term for what? You are fired, right? Involuntary unemployed. People getting fired for cause, right? Again, it's a problem, but it's not a problem macroeconomically where policymakers have to jump in. This could be simply the case, it's just not working out, right? I mean, we think about people being fired for cause as being their characterization. It probably is. Maybe they just can't cut it, or they're lazy, or just don't want to work, or they're undependable, don't show up on time, all these kind of things. And all that would be included, but sometimes it's just not a very good fit. It's not a very good match altogether. And when that happens, it's like, okay, we got to part ways. It does happen. And it's not some huge sin if you're in that position as a worker. It just does not work. It just does not fit the situation. And sometimes people realize they're in the wrong job, frankly. And the sooner you realize you're in the wrong job, the better. Really, believe me. If you're in the wrong job, the rest of your life will be not as happy as it could be. It really is a bad. I was in a job once for about 3.5 years that it was not a good situation, but I was in graduate school at the time, and I just kind of stuck with it. And because I really didn't have a lot of choice, but it was really not a good fit. And particularly if you've got a boss that's impossible. If you've got an impossible boss, I don't know if you've ever had one, chances are good you'll have one sometime in your life. It really is difficult. As a result, sometimes you just have to part ways. Either you leave or they tell you to leave, that sort of thing. So involuntarily unemployed would be an example of this. And there are all kinds of things. Now, when we talk about frictional unemployment, what we're really saying is a lot of times liken this to sort of the grab bag or the junk drawer, if you like. That's maybe a overly informal way of describing it. But ways that we can't characterize it, we simply put into that, including this last category, which sometimes people will put as its own category. But I think it's really more of an element of frictional, and it's seasonal unemployment. Seasonal unemployment is, so who are we talking about here? Workers who are losing their jobs, but it's not like some giant secret that they're going to lose their jobs. Who are we talking about here? What are some examples? But I'm talking about season throughout the year. Okay.
Cliffs.
What's that? Cliffs. Yeah, Cliffs. Good example. Cliffs. If you're working as the a lifeguard at Cliffs, and suddenly Labor Day or whenever they close rolls around, okay, job's no longer here. That's not some huge shock. Ski instructors, tax preparers, people who work at department stores at Christmas time to wrap gifts. These are all seasonal jobs. People work at Amazon or UPS during the busy holiday season. These are all jobs that are going to disappear because we know they're going to disappear. That's frictional unemployment. And so, well, it's frictional, but it's seasonal more specifically. And some people put it as a separate category, but it really it depends on the time of year. Keep in mind too, a lot of agriculture will fit into this. Now, we don't do a very good job, frankly, of capturing of employment and unemployment in the agricultural sector. In fact, whenever you see on the news, they'll talk about non-farm payrolls. Well, that sort of almost says, well, we don't really care about farm payrolls. Well, it's not that we don't care about it, but it's difficult to account for. And one reason why, and I come from a farm family, so I'm very familiar with this. One reason why is because people are moving around so much. There's lots of labor that's very casual labor. And frankly, there's a lot of labor that's really under the radar being paid cash because these are workers who really don't have the proper documents. And as my uncle, who still farms, has said that sometimes he has no choice but to hire labor that probably isn't here in the US legally. But, as long as they're able to do the job, he's willing to hire them and he's willing to take his chances. And so frankly, when we talk about non-farm unemployment, we are really missing a big segment of the population, which frankly becomes seasonally unemployed once whatever they're doing, whenever that season is over, then they go do something else or don't do something else. If they don't do something else for the time being, then they're seasonally unemployed, but we're probably not really capturing them. So that's an area of the economy that's sort of a missing, it's a gap, it's a problem. And there's been lots of talk about immigrant labor and whatnot, but it's nothing new. I mean, sometimes you hear the news and it makes it sound like this is something brand new. Undocumented workers working in agriculture. This has been going on for a very, very long time. And I think that we don't really adequately account for that as an element of seasonal unemployment. And yet, when we talk about the labor force, we're talking about, it doesn't really matter what people's nationality or status is. We're just simply talking about those people who are available to work. And I'll give that definition a bit more concretely here in a minute. Okay, so that's frictional unemployment. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything that's sort of glaring here, and I don't really think that so much there is, but maybe we'll circle back to it. All right, structural unemployment. What does it say in our slide? Unemployment resulting from a mismatch between workers' skills and the demand for them. Okay, this is a very sticky problem. Okay, and I'll tell you why it is in a minute, but it's tricky because this is a case in which workers simply can't find work, and they probably will never find work doing what they used to be doing. Okay, so what are some examples of structural unemployment? Well, the first one is simply the element of what we call offshoring. And that is jobs, outsourcing or offshoring, whichever you prefer. Outsourcing is probably a more common term. Outsourcing, by the way, doesn't even have to be out of offshoring. It could be simply an industry moving to a different part of the country where labor costs are less expensive, where cost of living is less expensive, where taxes may be lower, maybe where the local government is offering incentives. Keep in mind, too, that I think I talked about the textile industry a couple of weeks ago in this class, where the textile industry started out in this country in New England, in Massachusetts and that area, and then moved south to Carolinas, and then it just kept moving south to Latin America. Now it moved east. So this is a common feature of industrialization, that is moving operations. And when that happens and you don't want to be mobile, which a lot of people do not want to be, then you're out of work and there's really not much that can be done for you. That's an example of offshoring. I mean, I'm just going to put outsourcing. I think most people know it as outsourcing. But offshoring is specifically where it leaves the country. And lots and lots of companies, many dozens of thousands. I mean, we're talking about 50-some thousand firms just since 2000 have left the U.S. to go elsewhere, really to take advantage of lower costs primarily. That's usually the issue, is lower costs. And for those who are working in an area, say in the U.S., in which their firm is leaving, it's usually not a matter of, hey, we're moving to Juarez or wherever you can go or not go. It's usually not even offered as an option. Sometimes firms will move to cheaper places in the country and they'll say, we have an option of moving you. We can move you, right? Sometimes people go, sometimes they don't go, but this is really not an option. This is structural unemployment because they're going somewhere less expensive. We're moving to India, we're moving to China, we're moving to Mexico, whatever. Okay, so those are structural, that's an example of structural unemployment. Also, jobs replaced by technology. This is a long story. It's one of the great oldest stories in economics, right? Jobs replaced by technology. This is ever since industrialization began, sometime in the 1800s in Europe, there have been stories about people whose jobs have been replaced by machines. A long running story. And of course, and it's also the fodder for science fiction and all this, that the robots are going to take over and whatnot. And I don't know the area, but you get the idea that sometimes the issue is that jobs are going to be replaced by technology. And the theory is always, and it's one that is not without reason, but the idea that the job, that labor unemployment will rise because all the jobs will be taken by machines. And in fact, that really hasn't happened. And the reason why is the labor market's a little bit more resilient and the economy is more resilient than what a lot of people thought was the case. Yes, there are jobs that are gone and they're not ever coming back, probably. There used to be telephone operators, a lot more telephone operators than what there are now. If you look at old movies and whatnot, people pick up phone operator, right? When's the last time you talked to an operator on the phone? I'm talking about a telephone operator. I can't even tell you last time I did that. Bank tellers mostly gone. I mean, I walked in and I go into a bank, my bank, maybe once a year, once every 2 years. I don't really have any reason to go too often. And I go there and maybe there's one teller working in, I go to Wells Fargo downtown, big, gigantic lobby, gigantic. There's nobody working in it, and it's like one or two tellers and all these empty offices because they do things online, they do electronically, payroll, you don't have to stand in line to deposit your paycheck. All this is good for consumers. It makes life a little bit easier, but it means those jobs are gone. Cashiers at retailers. Most of us, I went to Smith's last night, didn't use a cashier, scanned my way out, and off I went on the way. Those jobs are probably not coming back either. Also, think about this. And this is something that for those of you who entered the business world or about to, you may come across this as being a thing, and that's just a fair warning, the whole idea of Secretary's Day. Okay. I know for managers, because the question is, who is a secretary? Secretary's Day is basically what you take your secretaries to lunch and all that. You're nice to them. But then the question is, who is a secretary? Because the job is mostly experienced. If you want to reach somebody in business who's a manager, even somebody fairly high, and you can't get a hold of them, you probably don't talk to their secretary. You do what usually? You leave them a voicemail, you email, you text them, you get with them somehow. If they need to file something, it's usually electronic. They don't need somebody to do that old traditional secretarial. In fact, why I say it's a sticky problem, because when I was in management and Secretary's Day rolled around, we had to really decide how we would observe it or not observe it. And we had some people who were very irate. I mean, not just irate, but very irate that they were being included as secretaries. They thought, I'm not a secretary, I'm a whatever. And that's a tough problem. So, but I bring that up because that's what happens when jobs are replaced by technology. We don't really need secretaries that much. Right? In fact, they're called administrative assistants because they are paraprofessionals that do a lot of things. Sometimes even make decisions for the boss when the boss is away, that sort of thing. So you get the idea. But that's an example of a job replaced by technology. And by the way, there are all kinds of jobs that are gone and are probably just never coming back. Right? Blacksmiths, candle makers, shoe repair, like compliment shoe repair people, right? Now, as soon as I say this, somebody's going to say, hey, I know a shoe repair person. I get that. I know a guy who's a shoe repair person, right? He's about to retire. So you get the idea that, I mean, if we have a pair of shoes that has blown a hole in them, we're probably not going to get it fixed. We're just going to throw them away, right? Huh? Yeah, it's just not really a thing so much anymore. Chimney sweeps, yes, I know there are chimney sweeps, but it's not really that. Most of us don't burn wood or coal in our fireplace to warm our homes, and so these are jobs that are gone. And for the most part, they're not coming back. Elevator operators. I mean, the list is long. I've been all day going through the list of jobs that have vanished. But the thing about this is that this is the most difficult from a policy standpoint to deal with. And I'll talk about the reasons why in just a second. But the list is kind of long. That is jobs replaced by technology, okay, where the jobs no longer exist. Okay. All right, so any other examples here that are glaring and I should miss them? Remember, the definition is mismatch. Something's gone on, workers have a skill, there's no longer demand for them. And so you have instances in which people try desperately to find work in this particular area, and there's just no demand for them. And as a result, they've got to move on. Okay, so what about the third category, cyclical? This is the one that I mentioned a minute ago that is probably the most commonly understood. And that's simply the examples here are anyone laid off due to a poor economy. Okay? And it's usually temporary, although who knows how long that temporary condition can last. What if the firm doesn't survive the downturn in the economy? Okay, and so we're talking about a poor macro economy. And I know that we sort of, it sounds a little bit wonky to refer to the macro economies, but when we say macro economy, we're talking about the entirety of the economy. We're not talking about a slice of the economy, we're talking about the whole thing. That somehow the economy is poor, and so people are laid off as a result because they're caught in the downdraft through no fault of their own, right? they're no fault of their own. They're swept up in whatever's going on in the macro economy. And so right now, it looks like we're sort of on the brink, maybe, of a recession. Well, I've been saying this now for the last several months, and yet the labor market data keeps coming in strong. I mean, unemployment last month, it's reported on a monthly basis. It actually fell last month. So that doesn't sound much to most people like there's an issue with the labor market if the unemployment rate keeps falling, does it? So it's kind of a strange thing that sometimes we have this instance in which the economy seems like it's slowing down, but not really. But I think that if recession, then those who are working will likely find themselves out of work simply because of the fact that the economy itself is sort of running out of steam. Okay. All right. So questions for me about that. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find the site. It's on the BLS website, and let me see here. Let me see if I can pull something up here. Oh, here we go. BLS. Okay, here we go. Oops, that's not it. Okay, and I'll come back to this. So I just want to make sure I found this before I lost my train of thought there. So okay, so that's structural unemployment or cyclical unemployment. So here's the deal when it comes to cyclical unemployment. What do we do about it? Well, that's a good question, and it's really a policy question. And I return to this idea that I've said this before, but pretty much any time in this class we use the term policy, we're almost always talking about government policy, and then it's government that really has to jump in and sort of do something about it. So anyway, so let's get to this issue of what to do about it. Okay, and because I want to make sure that we're all clear on the idea that not all unemployment is the same, and because it's not all the same, that our responses have to be different. Okay, we have to be very clear that sometimes somebody quitting their job is not at all the same, and just because they want to take 3 months off and sit on the beach is not at all the same thing as somebody who is really working hard, trying to support a family, and was laid off through no fault of their own. That's a different dynamic altogether. Okay, just like a teenager who quits the job at Sonic because they want to take off for the weekend and they're not allowed to. That's different than somebody who can't find work as a programmer because the programs that they used to write no longer are in demand, and that's an issue. So what to do about it? Well, we're going to say that, and keep in mind here that when I say problem, I'm simply saying the burden or the onus, that is the responsibility, in terms of who has to do what is aligned with it. So we're going to say in frictional unemployment, there's no problem with the worker and no problem with the economy. So therefore, no government policy is needed. Now, when I say no problem with the worker, yes, somebody who's laid off for cause, yes, if you punch your boss, yeah, I'd say it's a good chance you'll be fired, right? And you could say, well, how do you say that's no problem with the worker? Well, I say there's no problem with the worker here from an economic standpoint, not from a necessarily a behavioral standpoint. They could presumably find work. Again, it's just that they made a big mistake. Punching your boss is not a good thing, right? So, and it's likely to get you fired if not more, right? So we're saying that from an economic standpoint, there's no problem, but there's also no problem with the economy. All these examples, even seasonal unemployment, there's really not anything we can do about it because they are what they are. There's always going to be some amount of labor that's unemployed for all kinds of reasons. And I know that if I said to you as a normative proposition, remember normative statements of what should be, that the unemployment rate should be 0, right? Well, the unemployment rate, should it be 0? Because that sort of denies the fact that there is going to be always some unemployment. And by the way, if we say it should be 0, then that sort of harkens back to economies that put everybody to work whether they want to work or not in jobs that they may or may not want to work at. So very authoritarian, dictatorial, sort of totalitarian states. And we don't want that. We would like people to have free entry and exit from into and out of the labor market. So there's always going to be some amount of unemployment. I think that's just like there's always going to be some amount of crime and some amount of pollution. This is simply a problem that's going to be there, okay? And this is sort of the base issue with frictional. Structural unemployment, the problem is with the worker. And again, I'm not picking on the worker. I'm simply saying the burden, the onus is on the worker. Unfortunately, there's no problem with the economy unless you believe that the economy, through its sort of dynamism, if you like, maybe I'm sort of overselling the case here, but the economy is changing, it's dynamic. Unless you think that's a problem, then there's really nothing to be done about it. I mean, I don't know that a lot of people want to bring back elevator operators or people who pump gas, right? That's good. It's good.
I lived in Oregon.
Oregon is one of those states where they pump your gas. I think New Jersey also.
It's nice not getting out of your car.
It's nice not getting states, right? Oregon and New Jersey.
They make pretty good tips.
Yeah, well, I bet they do. Yeah, it's kind of good. Good. But those jobs are likely not going to come back, and they've got us conditions to do that. Just like if we want a refill of our drinks, in a lot of restaurants, you just go get it yourself. Sometimes that's something they don't really want because people sort of abuse the privilege, but nonetheless, a lot of jobs are disappearing, and we're saying the problem is with the worker. And again, it sounds like a really cruel statement that, hey, it's your fault. Well, we're not saying it's the worker's fault. We're saying that it's their issue. Here's the thing about it is that what's the solution to structural unemployment? Because we're saying no government policy is needed because this is part of the natural. This is the natural evolution of industrialization. Since the Industrial Revolution began, jobs have come and gone. Some jobs no longer exist at all, right? So what's the solution? The worker's going to do what? It's a burden's on the worker, buddy. So what's the worker got to do? Get retrained, find something new, go back to school, get training in something. I mean, and by the way, I mean, like, this is what I like about CNM is that, you know, we've got so many different programs here. Like, you know, I've got a niece who, you know, she kind of took some time off during the pandemic, didn't really want to go and sit in classrooms. Of course, not that there weren't that many classrooms to sit in, but, you know, she's down to the point where she is going to think about doing college or doing some kind of program or not. And I said, well, think about our coding academy, our coding boot camp, several weeks, and suddenly you can be out making, you know, I think the average salary is over 50,000 per year, so it's not bad. Not bad at all as a starting pay. But that's an example of somebody who maybe if whatever you're doing is no longer working out, then you've got to find something else to do because your job is probably not coming back, whatever it is you're doing, right? Or move, and sometimes it's simply a question of moving. And one of the reasons why structural unemployment is coming down is because of the fact that more people are mobile today. They go where the jobs are. You know, even in my parents' generation, as much as my parents moved around, mostly because my dad was in the military, but after that was over, they didn't really want to move anymore. And so my dad had job offers, but he just didn't, in other states, just didn't want to take them. You know, nice job offer in Des Moines, Iowa. He didn't want to move to Des Moines. So he stayed put. So you kind of get the idea that if you wanted to cure the problem, it lies with you, the worker, and it's job training, it's retraining, it's finding something different. Okay, second one, unemployment. We're saying there's no problem with the worker, and the problem is with the economy, and therefore government policy action is needed. So this is the only one of the three kinds of unemployment that requires government to do something about it. Now, the question is what to do about it in cyclical unemployment, and we're going to say the government should engage in what we call counter-cyclical policy. And we're going to spend probably some portion of every class session, the remaining part of the semester, talking about some sort of anti-cyclical or counter-cyclical policy, something to counter the business cycle, because sometimes it's underperforming, and so the government needs to step in and hit the gas to bring the economy back to full employment. Sometimes, though, the economy is going too fast, and so the government needs to hit the brakes, and therefore it has the effect of raising unemployment. This is kind of where we are right now, because the unemployment rate is very low. 3.4% is the unemployment rate, and that's what we call the U3 measure. And I'm going to get to that here in just a second as to how we get to that measure. Okay, so cyclical unemployment is where the onus is on the government what to do about it. Now, let me tell you one thing here, and I just want to sort of clarify this a bit, because when we talk about macro policy and we're talking about government action in the economy, it's oftentimes controversial. And as we get a little bit later in the course, we're going to talk about macro theory and how there really are two very broad schools of thought as to macroeconomic thinking, as to how the economy works, and more importantly, what should be done about the economy. So we're not quite there yet, but what does it hinge upon? is there some issue that really divides the two schools? And it's this, it's government and what role the government should play, if at all, because there are those who think the government shouldn't do very much at all. And I mean, in the past, there have been some economists who said the government shouldn't do anything at all whatsoever. That if there's a downturn in the economy, the government should just lay back and not do anything. I think that's a really minority view at this point, to the point where it's almost non-existent. But keep in mind, as of the Great Depression, that was a prevalent view. Because the metaphor was of a market that's out of equilibrium. And the idea is, okay, if it's out of equilibrium, it'll get back to equilibrium. In other words, if something is out of whack, as the conventional economic thinking of the time went, it will get itself back in whack automatically. It will just take time. And there are some economists, a very few, but they're out there, certainly, and they're not invisible, who are saying that, well, really, government doesn't need to do much. Even if we have something like a financial crisis of 2008, it may just take longer to get back to full employment, but the government does more harm than good. That's one sort of starkly opposing view from another view that says government is needed. And when I underline this, I'm saying this is what we call the mainstream view. Most people believe that government action is needed. And by the way, it's tempting to sort of make this into a right-left political kind of thing, conservative and liberal. And I think that there's some basis for doing that, but it's not strictly about that. It's not only about politics. Sometimes it's about a legitimate discussion and controversy about what government should do versus what government should not do. And I think the class into one particular point of view. I'd rather let you decide what you think about it. Now, by the way, there are lots of instructors, faculty members all across the country who will try to lecture on at length about what they think is the proper view. I'm not really going to do that. In fact, I like to sort of keep my views out of it because I don't want anybody to get a misunderstanding as, oh, they're only making setbacks because he's a level. I really don't want that to be part of the discussion. But it will come up as we get into talking more about government policy. And yes, politics is involved. Whenever government's involved, politics is involved. So we'll get to that. Okay. All right. So questions about anything we talked about with regard to these types of unemployment. Yeah.
Didn't unemployment originally stem from the questionnaire?
Well, unemployment's always been around. Are you talking about the measure of unemployment? Yeah, okay. So when we talk about measuring any of these, really the Depression is the time in which we started to really get a better grip on measuring these things. And which is why I think I mentioned on Tuesday that sometimes you'll see, I don't know, you'll be watching a documentary and they'll talk about the prices of goods in 1700, like George Washington paid so much for a farm, and in today's dollars that'd be worth this. Well, that doesn't really mean very much. First of all, it was a different currency, it was a different price structure, all that. So it's difficult. Measurement was difficult in general. So the Great Depression really forced the issue of trying to get the government to be able to account for things. So when we say unemployment really wasn't being measured very well, it really wasn't. And but neither was inflation, neither was the money supply, neither was all these measures that we're going to get into a bit later. So in a lot of ways, macroeconomics, the very idea did grow out of the Depression, because up until that point, if there was a macro problem, people thought it'll just work its way out. It'll fix itself. I'm losing my voice. It's only Thursday morning. I've got more to go yet. Yes. So yeah, in some ways, yes, your question is right. A lot of this didn't really start to when it became important for government to be able to measure these kinds of things. And the same goes about GDP. We really didn't have very good measures, even though we can pull up the GDP measure from last time. The BEA website, it'll go back to, I think it goes back to 1929. But that is not very good data. I mean, how do you in 20s and 30s when a lot of people don't have phones and there's no internet, there's all kinds of things that we take for granted now that are not there. Okay. All right. So questions about these three kinds of unemployment. Again, I came across a measure of like 9 measures of unemployment. That's somebody slicing and dicing the way they want. Okay, how do we compute the unemployment rate? Okay, so we talked about unemployment. We really haven't talked about how we compute it. But before we do anything, let's talk about this denominator here. It's called the labor force. And this is important that we define who's in the labor force, because the measures that I'll give you as to the government visions of how we measure unemployment really depend on who's being counted, who's not being counted. Number one, the labor force is the number of those working. That's pretty obvious, right? If you're working, you're in the labor force. By the way, what if you're working part-time? Are you in the labor force if you're working part-time? Yes, you're in the labor force. If you work part-time, you're in the labor force, okay? But we're going to slice and dice the labor force a bit later. Plus, those actively looking for work. So, in other words, those available to work. That is, available to work means if you're offered a job today, you can start reasonably soon. It might not mean today, but it might mean soon, like within a week, right? You know, you may have to, get babysitters or whatever, but you can start soon, right? So if you're offered a job today, can you accept it today? That's really what we're saying. And can you start reasonably soon? Now, I want to address something which is a controversy that comes up from time to time, and that is the issue of what appears to be double counting and therefore dilutes the unemployment rate. And that's been an allegation that people have had for years. And that is, hey, if the labor force includes people actively looking, it must mean they're unemployed. So we get unemployed here and unemployed there. So aren't you just bumping up the denominator to lower the unemployment rate? Is that what's going on there? Well, no, not really, because the labor force measures anybody who is available to work. Because people who are what we call marginally attached. That is, they come, they go, yes, they're part of the labor force, but they don't really work a job and they've been there for 10 years, 40 hours a week or whatever. It's a little bit more difficult than that. They may work in occupations which marginal attachment is part of the reality. A lot of people in the entertainment field, it's all the time. If you work in anything having to do with music, it's a gig economy. I mean, the gig economy is a thing that, the media likes to talk about things like they're brand new, right? The gig economy has been around forever, right? The idea of people taking an occupation for a couple of weeks or whatever, then it's gone, right? It's done. And that's what we call marginally attached to the labor force. So the labor force is the number of those working plus those looking for. So we take the number of unemployed, and by the way, how do we know who's unemployed, who's not? There are a couple different ways to get to it. Number one, what's one obvious way that the government knows? And by the way, it is the government, the federal government, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is computing this on a monthly basis. How do they know who's unemployed, who's not? What's one thing that unemployed people do that's sort of ring the register? When you're laid off, what do you tend to do? Or the day you're laid off, or withdrawal. You file. Right, yeah, no. Well, you might already. You're going to file for unemployment benefits, right? File for unemployment benefits. And by the way, and one of the things that occurred to me, and it didn't really occur to me until just a couple of years ago, is that I had, particularly my online classes, I would talk about unemployment, and people would not talk, and it just was just the way that we think about things. They would think about unemployment benefits. We talk about unemployment, they'd be talking about unemployment benefits because people say, I didn't get my unemployment this week, right? What they mean is unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits are the benefit you get if you're eligible to get them from the government. Unemployment is simply the economic phenomenon, right? So when we talk about unemployment, we're not talking about benefits unless we say unemployment benefits. Okay, so because I kept wondering in these discussions why people kept talking about benefits. I mean, I'm saying, isn't or money coming in or whatever? Well, the money's not sufficient to live on. What are you talking about? They're talking about, and it's just the way we talk, right? Somebody's on unemployment. They're on unemployment, meaning they're getting unemployment benefits, right? But this is different than the unemployment rate. So if you're unemployed, often you're going to file for unemployment benefits, whether you get it or not is whether you're eligible. But in recent years, the eligibility to jump through are not exactly that high. And some states are more stringent than others. New Mexico happens to not be that particularly difficult from my understanding. I know I had a brother-in-law who's had to work for about a year. I ended up filing his unemployment benefit once a week. I did that for him because he was pretty much clueless as to how to do that. So, so it was not a big burden to get over. Some states, it's a different story because unemployment benefits are it's a federal program that's funded through what's called the federal unemployment tax. called the FUTA tax. FUTA stands for Federal Unemployment Tax Act. It's a tax on businesses to pay for the unemployment benefits people get when they're laid off. And that rate varies depending upon company's record of laying people off versus employing them. So when you file for unemployment, you're tapping into that. But it's a federal state program. And so these programs are administered by the state, sort of similar to Medicaid. It's administered by the state. Unemployment benefits, federal program administered by the state. So the unemployment rate is the number of unemployed divided by the number of the labor force. And then why don't we make it times 100? Because we're going to end up with something like 0.034. If we multiply it by 100, we can put it to a percentage. That's all we're doing. Anytime you multiply it by 100, you're simply moving the decimal point 2 points to the right or 2 places to the right, and you're putting a percentage on there. Okay, so that's the unemployment rate as it is. Okay, so that's how we arrive at how we measure it. Now, what I want to do is this. I was able to pull up here a minute ago, and let's see if I can get it up on the screen here. And that is, we measure the unemployment rate. So hopefully everybody can see this. Let me see here. Let me just make sure that people on the Zoom call, well, can see this. I think they can. Okay, yes. All right, they can. Okay. So let me swivel a little bit here because I think it's, there we go. Okay, so this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is kind of small, I apologize, but it is what it is. I mean, I can blow it up a little bit, I suppose, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics is part of the US Department of Labor. It's part of the executive branch of government. And so it's maybe a little bit easier to see. So the government has 6 different measures of unemployment. And they basically, if you could, and let's not really get into the seasonal versus non-seasonal adjustment. Seasonal adjustment just means that there are some occupations that bulk up during certain parts of the year and dial down in other parts. Construction, a lot of construction jobs are simply very low hours worked during winter months, particularly parts of the country where you can't really do much construction. This part of the country, we can pretty much work all year round. Like Michigan, Wisconsin, no way. Can you drill into the ground in frozen ground, lay pipe or something like that? You just can't do it. And so they do it ahead of time if they know they're going to be doing it. And so you have to seasonally adjust that kind of work. Okay. Agriculture, same deal. Let's not worry about that. And notice that as we go down from what we call U1 to U6, the unemployment rate grows because we're capturing more people. Where in the labor force, right? It's the definition of the labor force that's growing here. Plus, there are some people that we're now including the unemployment rate that is also growing. So U1, persons unemployed 15 weeks or longer as a percentage of the civilian labor force. These are people who are very short-term unemployed. Okay. And by the way, we say civilian labor force because what's not really included in this is military workers who are by definition employed, but they're also, a lot of them are not even in the United States. Much of our military personnel are deployed overseas, and so they're not really part of the U.S. economy. You might say, well, wait a minute, they pay taxes. Well, yes, they do pay taxes, but all Americans pay taxes on their worldwide income. So this is the civilian labor force, but we'll include them a bit later, okay? 2 is, I hate this term job losers. I hate the term loser anyway, but so like my son, yeah, I was always a loser, right? But and persons who completed temporary jobs, these are people who are working mostly temporary, okay? But they're there, but they're working a bit, they're not working a bit. We know them because there's a large segment of population of temp workers. They come in, they leave, they come in, they leave, and they, that's what it is. This is, when we talk about the official unemployment rate, it's U3. So this is what we call the official unemployment rate. So if you hear on the news, the unemployment rate, so for like, for December, right? Or for actually for January, because we get the data the first Friday of every month. So last Friday, we get unemployment rate data, and it was 3.4% for January, it's the month prior. And that's a low unemployment rate. And look at what the trend has been, it's been downward. So when we talk about the economy slowing down, well, not really just yet, right? The government's trying to slow things down to sort of squeeze this inflation out, but the labor market is still strong. This is the official rate, the unemployment rate. So what are these other 3? Well, we're now picking up more people, including what we call discouraged workers. So who are they and why are they not in the traditional unemployment rate that's included on the news media, right? Well, a discouraged worker is somebody who started to look for work and is no longer working. And we don't really have a good track of who they are because number one, they're not filing for unemployment benefits because their benefits are expired. And they quit working and they quit looking and they're discouraged and they can't find work. And this sometimes I have to think includes a lot of structurally unemployed people who, and this is it sounds like a really mean statement, but it really is the case that sometimes it takes a while for structurally unemployed people to realize, hey, my job is not coming back. It's never coming back. A lot of auto workers have lost their jobs in recent years, and those jobs are not coming back. It does not take people, a quarter panel onto a car frame. Robots do that. And robots have been doing that for a long time. And those jobs are just not coming back. A lot of auto jobs are simply never coming back, ever. And so as a result, sometimes these workers are discouraged and just can't find work. And yet they try desperately to find work and it doesn't really happen. Or they're discouraged for whatever reason. Now, there are workers who frankly are unemployable, various reasons, and I don't think I'm going to get to that today, but we'll talk about that. And it's an unfortunate condition, and it's not one thing, it's a lot of things, but that also goes into that. So when we talk about discouraged workers, we're talking about people who are not there. We don't know really how many there are, it's an estimate. And notice it's bigger, so we're saying about 2/10 of the labor force is maybe that, 2/10 of 1%, okay? Not a huge number, but it is a number, okay? Also, we're growing bigger with discouraged workers, plus all other marginally attached people, okay? Marginally attached to those people work, stop working, they work 6 months, quit, come back, work, they're jumping around. And then finally, the most comprehensive is what we call those who are employed, but also unemployed part-time for economic reasons. This is what we call underemployment. We're going to get to that more next week, underemployment. This is a big problem. And look how big this number is. It's over 3% higher than the actual employment rate, because we're talking about people who were maybe working full-time and now can only find, or we're working as a whatever engineer, and now they're working I don't know, driving a taxi, right? That was always one of the big.
Like I've seen like somewhere on Twitter actually, someone saying that yes, the unemployment rate is low, but they're working 3 jobs just to
Yeah.
pay their lifestyle.
Right. Exactly. And that is the thing. And so that's one of the problems. And we're going to talk about that. So his statement was that yes, the unemployment rate is low, but because a lot of people can't get full-time work and they get jobs. That they may not have health benefits in any of those jobs. That is a serious issue as well. Or if they do it, then maybe the benefits aren't very good, you know. And so that's, I know with my wife's firm, they have a lot of part-time workers and they sometimes choose not to get the benefits because frankly, they're not that good for part-time workers. They're just not that good anyway. Economically, it's really not. Hire a part-time worker who's probably only going to be there for a few months. So let's be part-time workers. How many people work a part-time job and they're there for 10 years? I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen very often, you know. And so people who work part-time. This U6 measure is an important measure because it captures what we call underemployed. And it's not just people working part-time who would prefer to work full-time. It's also people like the example I just gave who were doing something else and can't find work in their area and therefore taking a job earning a lot less, but they're not unemployed. We know they're there, it's just that they're underemployed. And this doesn't even include the fact that there are a lot of people who just simply are not in the labor force, period. We're not even counting them because they've left the labor force. And this goes to an even broader measure called the labor force participation rate, when it's basically saying we're taking the number of unemployed, same numerator, but we're dividing it by every adult age 15 to 64, every adult. And then if only about half of people 15 to 64 are actually working. It's an astounding, and it's coming down in recent years. People have left the labor force, they're not coming back. And a lot of people are wondering why that is. And some of it is because of the fact that a lot of people are taking early retirement. COVID had a lot to do with it, I think. I think a lot of people, particularly in people who are highly compensated, who decided enough, I'm not going to risk going to work. I'm going to take early retirement and whatnot. We're starting to see that. So COVID was an interesting phenomenon, I guess, to say the least, but also from the economic standpoint, not just from the healthcare aspect. So anyway, so this is the way that this is divided. U3 is what you hear on the news, and that's a pretty good rate. It's pretty accurate. It's reported once a month. We get it very quickly, usually right after that month is over. That first Friday, it's something that economists look at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. We're looking for that. So when we come back on Tuesday, are there questions first of all before we we're really about out of time here? We've got about a minute left. Okay, well, we come back on Tuesday. We're going to pick this up and talk a bit more about what to do about what about unemployment. But in general, we're going to talk about why we care about unemployment. That sounds like a pretty obvious statement. It's like, well, duh, right? Well, there are problems with unemployment that go beyond just people being laid off. There are macro implications to this that make unemployment a bad thing. And so we're going to get to that. So, okay, so that's where we'll pick up on Tuesday. Have a good weekend. See you next week.